Well, my name is Michelle Adams, and I'm a civil engineer by training and practice. I've been in a practice for about 30 years, and I make my living designing projects that get built, everything from schools and fire engines to roads and shopping centers and developments. And when engineers and designers do projects and projects get built, there are a number of environmental regulations we have to adhere to related to things like stormwater management, erosion and sediment control, the mud that washes off during construction because construction's a messy process, how we handle waste, what happens if we want to cross a stream or we're going to impact a wetland, and when we're done building things, how the site has to be restored to reduce the damage on the natural resources. And what's been frustrating to me as an engineer who has to abide by these rules and regulations on so many projects, as I review the different oil and gas pipeline projects and well pad projects, that there are rules and regulations, but there are so many special exceptions for the industry. So you have the effect of it looks like a very regulated industry, but when you dig into the details, which is what engineers do, the rules aren't the same for oil and gas. So for example, if you have oil and gas pipeline coming through and they're going to disturb the site, the material they have to prepare and submit to get their permits is different than the material, say, a school would have to prepare and submit. And they're allowed to disturb the site. And things that, for example, building a road, building a gravel road, if you are any other project building a gravel road, that's site disturbance, and you have to manage the stormwater from it so that there's no increase in how much stormwater is coming off your site, which affects flooding and water quality. If you're in oil and gas, if you simply build your road out of gravel and put a crown on the road, that's considered a best management practice, and that's all you have to do. And so we see industries like the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which wants to expand near Valley Forge here, having to adhere to very stringent rules, as they should, for things like erosion and sediment control, for stormwater management. But those same rules don't apply to the oil and gas industry. And that has the effect, both during design and construction, of creating sites that are excessively disturbed during construction. And because of the construction practices and the lack of regulation, a lot of sediment release, a lot of stormwater release. And then after construction, those impacts continue. We see the soils compacted, we see sediment discharged into wetlands and streams. We see landscapes where there's little or no topsoil or vegetation that are considered restored. And again, I as an engineer find that this is happening because the rules are different for oil and gas. And that I find troubling. Everyone should have to play by the same rules. Every industry should have the same rules as everyone else. That's the idea of capitalism. It doesn't make sense that if you're digging geothermal wells for a school, for your heating and your energy, that you be subject to very rigorous methods to control the material coming out of the wells, to control the sediment, how you handle it, how you take it off site, how it's permitted in the first place, which affects your construction timeline, how long it takes you to get a permit. But the oil and gas industry has wells that are significantly larger in impact, and they're not subject to rules that are anywhere near as stringent. So I find that very troubling. So for example, here is some images of a geothermal wells being installed in an education center. You can see it's a very messy process to put these wells in, but you can see the measures in place to carefully collect the material coming out of the wells, to collect water that runs across the site that's muddy, the measures in place to protect any sediment from reaching the creek or wetlands. And here's photos of the site after it's built and restored and what it looks like. By contrast, here are images of an oil and gas pipeline site after restoration. This is finished restoration, and you can see no topsoil, no vegetation, very compacted soils. And when we go out and we measure those soils, we find that they're so compacted from the heavy equipment, and you can still see the tracks of the heavy equipment in the images, that it's almost as dense, almost as compact as concrete. And so, of course, when water hits that surface that's so compacted, it runs off. Plants are not able to establish. And what's troubling is that all this is avoidable. All this is preventable. Good construction practices, good restoration practices can avoid this sort of damage to our natural resources. These particular photos are in DCNR lands. This is public property that's being damaged, and it's preventable. And so there's a real need for the oil and gas industry regulations to be as stringent for oil and gas as they are for any other industry. Another example that's troubling with the upcoming regulations under Chapter 78 for oil and gas is the use of impoundments for material, for both freshwater and for waste material. And the proposed regulations would allow different impoundments, including centralized impoundments, which could be excavated, built with berms and dams, essentially. And these facilities would receive material from multiple wells. So waste material will be taken from different wells, trucked, and put in these open ponds. And here's an example of one such central impoundment in Pennsylvania. But material could be put in these open ponds. Under the regulations, you can see with the Pennsylvania topography, rolling hills, you can't build a big impoundment with this without placing fill, without essentially building a dam. And under the regulations for centralized impoundments as they're proposed, oil and gas industry could build dams, embankments that were up to 40 feet high without adhering to the same requirements that any other dam would in Pennsylvania. They wouldn't necessarily be subject to Chapter 105. Now, the Pennsylvania regulations, Chapter 105 for dams and waterways, has very specific regulations about site investigation, construction, maintenance, inspection, reporting, and a very rigorous permitting process. And so any structure should go through that process. There shouldn't be a separate special process for oil and gas facilities to build dams. They should be subject to the same rules as anyone else. So if an impoundment were to fail, there's all the physical consequences of the surge of water, the surge of fluid, which is what dams are usually worried about, simply the erosion, the flooding, the damage. But because of the material that could be in these impoundments with wastes, with unknown chemicals, with different materials, the impoundments could, if they fail, could have an impact directly affecting water resources. Since you're allowed to put these impoundments within a short distance, usually 100 feet, I believe, is the proposed regulations of a stream, discharge from these facilities could go directly into waterways, directly into wells, impact people's water resources. They could impact the groundwater if people are dependent on wells. One thing that's interesting is that if you're building an on-site septic system, a wastewater system for your home in Pennsylvania, and you dig into the soil and you encounter any indication of groundwater within the top 20 inches, you can't build a wastewater system. And the reason you can't is because the site's not suitable and you could contaminate the water. You could contaminate the groundwater. For the proposed regulations, if you're an oil and gas facility building a pit or an impoundment, if you encounter groundwater within 20 inches, you're allowed to put in drains and drain that groundwater and then put in your facility. So something is potentially damaging in terms of the contents as a waste pit for oil and gas can be within a groundwater table, and we're allowed to drain it, but you couldn't do that if you wanted to put an on-site septic system for your home somewhere in Pennsylvania. You wouldn't be able to build a wastewater system for your cabin in Pennsylvania, but you could put an impoundment there for oil and gas. Chapter 105 also covers stream crossings. So for example, this small pedestrian bridge had a very rigorous permitting requirement to build that little pedestrian bridge across that stream channel. The regulations that apply to a simple pedestrian bridge or any bridge or stream crossing should also apply to the oil and gas industry. There should not be a separate permitting process where it's easier. When there's little oversight, little review by the department, limited resources to review in the detail that's needed. And so we're completely dependent on the word of the designers and the installers. It's the fox guarding the hen house, essentially. And as a result, we see stream crossings that look like this condition here, where wetlands have been lost, sediments visible in the stream. You can still see the degradation, the damage to the vegetation. That is one of the biggest problems in my mind with how oil and gas is happening in the state of Pennsylvania.